ITCPH was a minor key player in the piggery business in the Philippines, trying to fight for its position as a training center. I remember the first thing that we bought was there were a couple of pencils and erasers and a ruler and a bundle of paper and notebooks, because yeah, you have to write down things and you have to start somewhere.
I think from the very start, kilala ng ITCPH doon sa training principle na learning by doing. Mahirap kasing magturo na puro sa lecture lang. We go outside the classroom, tapos nandyan yung training farm where they do the hands-on.
Kasi ang hands-on training talaga ang number one. Tawagin natin most effective method sa teaching kasi they do what they learn.
Katungtong ko lang noon sa ITCPH, gusto ko na yung atmosphere. Then yung learnings, iba sila sa ibang training na atinan ko. At saka yung mga bagong teknolohiya tinuturo nila.
Malaking pasalamat ko sa natutunan ko sa ITCPH. Nakaka-inspire ng tao. Gusto talaga matutunan.
ITCPH talaga, when you talk about swine, no other training center or no other institute or training center na comparable with ITCPH.
Ang ITCPH is service talaga for the pig farmers in the Philippines.
Well, ITCPH 1 is for our pork producers. That's why it's dedicated to the pig farmers. We will always assure the best of services relative to anything under the sun about swine. That's what ITCPH is.
All right. Hello. Good morning, everyone. And welcome again to ITCPH webinar series. So joining me today is Ms. Elaine Gutierrez, a technical staff of the International Training Center on Pig Husbandry, together with the chief of our training services, Ms. Ami Iguia. He's also here as a panel. And of course, our host, Mr. Gerald. And I, together with Ms. Elaine, I am Ms. Kim. We will be your moderators this morning, right? So today, July 3, 2020, is our last day to discuss various topics in swine. So this is related to our celebration of the 35th founding anniversary of the ITCPH. And so far, we had discussions on digital technologies, transforming pig production, feed innovation, lessons learned from ASF, and we thank you for your active participation online. So keep the energy on. And today, we will be delighted to hear about mortality composting. So just a short background with our foreign speaker this morning. He is a graduate of BS Agriculture at the University of Illinois, Urbana. He also took a master's degree on animal science at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and he acquired a PhD on nutrition at North Carolina State University. So among his international experiences is being an international leader for the American Institute for Goat Research International Programs. In terms of research, he collaborated with other scientists on projects related to nutrition, behavior, and many more. So he received grants for mortality composting and a main editor in publications in livestock. So currently, he is the Associate Professor of the American Institute for Goat Research, Langston University. And without any further ado, let us all welcome our speaker to discuss mortality composting. Let us all welcome Dr. Roger C. Merkel.
Thank you. As you mentioned today, we're going to talk about mortality composting. And I have done composting with goats, not with swine, but really the principles are the same for any livestock species. And today we'll talk about goats, and then towards the end of the presentation, I'll have some specific comments about composting poultry. So I'm going to start the presentation. So those of you who raise livestock are certainly aware that if you do have animals, at some point they're going to die. So you're going to have dead stock. The question then becomes, what will you do with your livestock mortality? In the United States, there are 5 lawful means of carcass disposal, and rendering is one, but it's very difficult to find, particularly for an individual producer. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find a rendering company to come to your farm to pick up 1 or 2 dead animals. Most companies now are associated with slaughterhouses or meat processing facilities or very large farms. Incineration is another disposal method. That does not mean open air burning. It has to be a dedicated incinerator, and in some states those have to be inspected and approved before you can use them. In the United States, there are some landfills where you can take dead animals. Of course, there is cost of transportation, tipping fees, which is the fee you have to pay the facility for taking your animal, and those are not really readily available. You really have to look online to find what those are. Burial is another option. There are requirements that vary by state. It can be expensive if you don't have equipment to dig the hole. It does not recycle nutrients. Carcasses actually can take 1.5 to 2 years to decompose after they're buried. And generally, the depth at which many carcasses are buried is below the root zone of plants. So you're really not getting those nutrients recycled back into your forage or whatever crops you may be growing. And then, of course, there are water contamination concerns as well. So composting is a good method of getting rid of your mortality. You can prevent improper disposal. prevents disease spread and water contamination. It is legal. It is cost effective. At the end of the process, you do get a nutrient-rich soil amendment for use on pastures or cropland. And in the United States, it does help improve the public perception of the sheep and goat industry. So composting is the controlled biological decomposition process that converts organic matter to a stable humus-like product. And in mortality composting, just like in any composting system, there are three things that we need. We need a nitrogen source, and in our case, that's the carcass. We need a carbon source, and here a few carbon sources are listed. We'll discuss more of these in the next slide. And finally, we do need water for that system to work. So we need a proper carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that's generally about 30:1. A proper moisture content of about 50%. We need oxygen in that pile because the type of decomposition we want is aerobic decomposition. We want those aerobic bacteria to proliferate and to break that carcass down. And we do need adequate pore size or airspace in that pile to maintain oxygen in the pile. So our carcasses are high in nitrogen. So we need a carbon source that is very high in carbon so we can try to get that carbon to nitrogen ratio of 30:1 towards the end of the composting process. And some common carbon source materials that we use here in the States include sawdust, if it is available in your area, rice hulls, different types of straw work well. Corn stalks can work. They should be chopped or reduced in size somewhat. If you're using whole corn stalks, that really won't work very well, and that may need to be mixed with some other type of material. You can use finished compost, and it's very common to mix finished compost with other types of carbon materials when you are composting carcasses. And you can see different types of manure listed there. Broiler litter, of course, is used for composting poultry, and then you see animal carcasses there at the bottom. So wood shavings, hay, straw mixed with manure or finished compost in a 50-50 mixture can work very well. Barn waste, such as stable waste from horses or perhaps from cattle or water buffalo, works well. If you are using poultry litter, it should be covered because you don't want any runoff, you don't want any leachate getting into the soil, mainly because of the high mineral content, the high phosphorus content, particularly of poultry litter, because that can cause some serious pollution and contamination in surface and groundwaters. So if you are using poultry litter, you should make sure that it is covered. What I generally tell farmers is for them to use whatever they have available. If they have some old moldy hay, then use that. They have straw or silage that they're not using, peanut hulls, rice hulls, whatever type of material they have, that's what they should be using to compost. We want to make this as easy as possible for them. If the electric company comes in and trims trees and chops up the branches, then they would have chipped wood from tree trimming, for example. Characteristics of good carbon sources is that they have the ability to get that proper moisture content of around 50% moisture. The particles should have some rigidity. Again, that speaks to pore space, making sure that there is oxygen in that pile. They should be high in carbon. There should not be anything in that carbon source that would attract any pests. It should be able to decompose, and it should have low bulk density, porous material, again, so that it can absorb moisture and maintain oxygen in that pile. So proper moisture, as I've mentioned, is about 50% moisture. If you are below that, then your decomposition process is going to be very slow. If you have too much moisture in the pile, what happens is that moisture can fill up the pore space, driving oxygen away from the pile, and then you end up with anaerobic decomposition, which is not what you want. We'll talk more about that here in some subsequent slides. But we do want aerobic decomposition, so we need that oxygen in the pile. To test for the moisture content in your pile, you can just take a handful of that compost material and squeeze it. If water drips out, then it's obviously too wet. If you squeeze it, open your hand and it falls apart, it doesn't stick together, then it's likely too dry. And what you want that material to feel like is just like a damp sponge. And then you're going to have about that proper moisture content. Different carbon materials are going to differ in absorbing water and getting to that 50% water content. Here, when I compost, if I use dry straw or dry hay, I have to add water just a little bit at a time because it does not readily absorb water. And if you add too much at one time, then you're going to have leachate, you're going to have water coming out of that pile, and you're going to have contamination, draw flies, and so on. So you don't want that to happen. If you are using dry straw or hay and you can mix that with some manure or stable bedding or some compost, then that's going to absorb water much more readily, and you're going to have a much easier time getting to that 50% moisture content. Again, too much moisture leads to anaerobic decomposition, which is slow, and it does generate odors. In high rainfall areas, you probably should have a cover on your pile so you don't get leachate to contaminate soil or runoff that could contaminate then surface or groundwater. Here in Oklahoma, we don't get a whole lot of rain, so most of the piles that are made here can be uncovered. We get about 950, 960 millimeters of rain annually. I know in the Philippines, you may get 2,000 or more millimeters per year. So you're going to have a lot more rainfall, and that can be an issue with uncovered piles. So piles with roofs on tend to work better. You can monitor and maintain that compost moisture percentage much easier. Rain and stormwater should be directed away from the pile. Again, you don't want to have problems in your pile from having too much water. We do want, again, available oxygen. Aerobic decomposition generates high heat. You can get in excess of 60 degrees Celsius temperature in that pile, and you do need a minimum of 54 degrees Celsius to deactivate pathogens, and that's generally going to kill weed seeds as well. To deactivate pathogens, it's a combination of temperature and how long the pile is at that temperature. So if you get a temperature above 54 degrees Celsius and you can maintain that for at least several days, and in a well-built pile, it's going to stay that way, could be for several weeks. And that's going to work much better in getting rid of pathogens. Also, the other bacteria that are present in the pile could help to deactivate some of those pathogens as well. Aerobic decomposition does not generate odors. In a well-built and well-maintained pile, you can stand right next to it and you really won't smell anything. That's what should happen in a well-built pile. If you do end up with anaerobic decomposition, the temperatures are going to be much, much lower. Decomposition is going to be much slower, and you will get odors coming out from that pile. So we want to make sure that we keep aerobic decomposition. Particle size of your carbon source is needed to maintain oxygen in the pile. That's why I mentioned earlier your carbon source should have a little bit of rigidity to it. If your carbon source is too fine, then there's not going to be enough air in the pile. Wood shavings, sawdust, animal bedding works well. Long-stemmed hay or straw is really too fluffy, if you will, to maintain the heat in the pile. There's too much pore space, there's too much exchange of air, and the heat generated by those bacteria in the pile will be lost. And you want a good covering layer on that to maintain that heat. You want to insulate that pile, keep the temperature high. That's the temperature the bacteria like to work at. So you have to make sure that you can do that. So if you do use some type of long stem hay or straw, you may have to layer that with manure or something else to make sure that that you're not losing heat. In siting your compost site, you want to keep it away from groundwater, from wells, roads, property lines. You don't want to use areas with poor drainage or excessively sandy soil. And when you are making a site, you should have a firm surface so you can drive your tractor or pickup truck or whatever that you need to haul carcasses and carbon material there and build your pile. So you have a good firm surface upon which to work. It should be away from public view. You may get animals who want to dig into the pile. I have had this issue here at Langston. We have possums that sometimes will dig in the pile. So some type of fence or wall or something is beneficial. Even stray dogs are going to go in and dig up some of those bones and so on. So some type of fence is probably needed. Here in the United States, the need for a composting permit varies by state. Generally, we have producers call the state veterinarian wherever they live to see if they do need a permit. Usually those are only needed for large animal operations, say large swine, poultry, or dairy farms. But again, different areas have different rules and those need to be checked upon. So in terms of our mortality composting structures or bins that can be used, large farms may wish to construct a permanent bin. It should have a concrete pad and a graveled area on which to work. And really a concrete pad would be great for all of your compost areas in high rainfall areas. Sturdy walls and a roof. You should have at least 3 bins in your structure. You could have 1 to 2 working bins. The third bin could store carbon source material, or it could be where your finished compost is curing before you're using it. And those bins should be a minimum of 2 meters wide, depending upon the type of equipment that you may be using. So here is the bin that we have constructed here at Langston University. Those boards in front are just in a wooden channel and they can be easily removed. And often anymore, I don't even put those back on because that area is fenced in. It's surrounded by chain link fence. So I don't really have a lot of problems with animals getting in. But it does have a roof, a nice concrete pad, and a small gravel area upon which to work. Here's just some other examples of compost bins. See, these are much larger, and they just use some gates on front to keep that material in the bays. Here's another facility for sheep, I believe this was built for. Farmers here in the United States, many of them, particularly in Oklahoma, are going to be looking at low-cost alternatives. Farmers with just a few animals really can't justify the expense of building a permanent bin. It's just too costly. So there are several different types of alternatives that those producers can use. Here's a compost pile made out of stock panels and some T-posts. And you can see that's just held together by wire in a circular pattern, and then the compost piled in the middle. Unused pallets can be used, and these work pretty well. Here they're arranged in a circle, and then there's a compost pile that was built in the center. And actually this worked very well for me. I was impressed with this, and just 1 T-post driven in for each pallet to kind of hold that in place, wired together. And that worked well. Some very large farms are going to use windrows if they have large numbers of mortality. And these are just long rows of composted carcasses. And when you have new mortality, those are just added to the end. These are much more difficult to manage. You do need equipment to turn those, and some of these really actually have some pretty specialized equipment to turn these windrows. And if you are using a windrow system, it should run up and down any slopes that it's built on so that rain can run between those windrows and then not get your piles too wet. So in terms of the composting process, when you're beginning, make sure you have plenty of carbon source, because you do want a nice thick base layer to absorb any liquid that may be coming out of the carcass. And you also do need a very thick cover layer as well. So our base layer should be 30 to 40 centimeters of this material to trap liquid that leaches from the carcass during composting. And I know that's a thick layer, but one thing you need to remember is when you lay that dead animal on top of that, they're going to be compressing that layer just because of the weight of the carcass. So you do need a thick layer there, and it does have to trap all that liquid that's going to come out of the carcass because there is considerable moisture that is trapped in that carcass. If you just think even of just in the rumen and the digestive contents, there's a lot of water. And then of course in muscle and fat, there would be water that's trapped in there as well that will come out during the composting process. So you're going to take your carcass and put that in the middle of your base layer, keeping it away from the walls of the bin or sides of your pile. If you do have to add a second carcass to that layer, you can put adult carcasses back to back, leaving some room in between them. Kid carcasses can actually be packed fairly closely, and you could really get quite a few kids in one layer of a mortality compost bin. I'm hoping you never have that many kids to compost, but it can be done. You should lance the rumen with a knife. That allows access by microbes to the inside of the carcass. It also does prevent the rumen from bursting due to gas buildup from ruminal microbes. In some cases, if carcasses are large, say for example, you're composting cattle or kettlebow or something, you actually may have to tie limbs together or remove a limb so that it's not too close to the bin wall or the sides of your pile. So all that does is just allow easier access for microbes to get in and help that carcass decompose. So here's my pallet bin with that base layer prepared. Put a layer of straw on, and then I had a doe and a kid that had died that we placed in the middle of that pile. Add water for that moisture content to get about 50%. And really how much water you add just kind of depends upon your carbon source. You know, I can add a couple of buckets of water here to the pile, and you're really probably not adding too much water to the carcass itself, but you're really adding it to that carbon source material surrounding the carcass because you want that whole pile to heat up because that's going to help deactivate those pathogens and help get that whole pile to a high temperature. So after you have added the water, then you can cover that first layer with about 25 centimeters of your carbon source material. Or if you're not going to put any more carcasses on right away, you can make that thick cover layer of at least 30 centimeters. Okay. So here I'm adding some water around those carcasses. We can add a second layer of mortality. Should something occur, we can just open the top of that pile, add some more carcasses, and then add water and lance the rumen, and then put on our cover layer. So that's fairly easy to do. Here we had a few kids that we were adding to the top of that mortality compost pile, and then those were covered then with a nice thick cover layer. About 30 centimeters of that carbon source material. Again, here in Oklahoma, we can get away without having roofed bins most of the time. So we would just shape that carbon source material on top like a cone so that rainwater could run off. That cover layer has several purposes. It is an insulating layer, so it does trap that heat that is given off by those bacteria as they're working. Those bacteria in the center of the pile, one of those byproducts from decomposition are different types of gases, and bacteria in other areas of the pile and in the cover of that pile are going to trap those gases, scavenge those gases, and use those to prevent odors as well. The cover layer is going to absorb moisture, and again, it's going to discourage insects and scavengers from attacking the pile. So here's an illustration of how your pile can look. We have that nice thick base layer. We have 2 adult carcasses there back to back. We have about 25 centimeters of material in between the first and the top layer. And then we have that nice 30 centimeter cover layer. So after a couple of weeks, as that carcass starts decomposing, then that pile is going to shrink. You may need to add some additional carbon source to build that pile back up. And you should check that pile occasionally to make sure animals haven't disturbed it, that no portions of the carcass are visible as that pile starts shrinking. Make sure that there are no odors. If there's odors, then something's gone wrong and you may need to troubleshoot. And then of course to check pile temperature. Here I have some long stem thermometers about 1 meter in length, and those can be inserted into the core of the pile to measure temperature. For farmers, if they don't want to purchase a thermometer, I just recommend that they take a piece of metal, such as reinforcing bar like that used in construction, cut that off to about 1 meter length and insert that into the pile. And then just occasionally pull that out and feel the tip. And if your pile's at 54 degrees Celsius, you can only handle that tip for 1 to 2 seconds. And then you just get an idea that your pile is heating. So that's a very, very low cost method for farmers who just want to know if their pile's working but aren't interested in exact temperature. So here's one small pile that I had made, and I think this just had 1 carcass in it, and that was probably a bit less than 2 meters across. This is about the minimum size of any pile that you would want to build. And I say that because small piles have a hard time maintaining heat. There's just not a lot of insulating qualities in a pile that small. So anything smaller than this probably wouldn't have worked too well. But you can see here, this pile was at this time at about 59 degrees Celsius. So it was heating very well. When the temperature of your pile drops below target levels, it gets down, below 50 Celsius or 40 Celsius. Then you may want to stir the pile to mix the contents and aerate it. If you do have a tractor, you can use that bucket to lift those contents and let them tumble out of the bucket to mix them up. Add water if necessary, allow it to dry if it's too wet. And generally 75 days is a good time frame. I probably shouldn't have the 60 in there, but 75 days works well for adult goats. And actually, other people have found 75 days works well even for cattle carcasses if the pile's well built and it's heating. Some producers may not have equipment to turn that pile, and that's fine. Mortality compost piles can be left unturned. They're just termed a static pile. The decomposition process is going to be slower if the pile isn't turned and watered. But again, if a farmer just wants a place to legally and easily get rid of their mortality, they're not interested in getting the compost quickly, they may not have equipment or may not have time, then they can leave the pile alone and it will still work. It'll just take longer. So in our pile, we're going to have a couple of different heat cycles. That first heat cycle, we're going to have a high rate of both anaerobic and aerobic bacterial activity. And here that anaerobic activity is kind of in the core of the carcass. Because initially, in the core of the carcass, in the GI tract, in the muscles and so on, there's going to be anaerobic bacteria that are going to proliferate and start that breakdown. As that breakdown continues, then aerobic bacteria are going to take over and you're going to get that high heat. During this first heat cycle, really almost all of the flesh should be decomposed and a lot of the small bones are broken down. And then after some time, the temperature is going to start to decrease. That's when you would turn your pile to aerate it and check the moisture content, maybe add some water. You're going to get a second spike in heat, and that spike generally isn't going to last as long as the first spike, but you're going to get continued breakdown of those large bones, skull, and so on. And then in the end, you're going to have stabilization of the compost material. So here's a graph showing the 2 heat cycles of a pile that I did here at Langston. And you can see here within 1 week after building the pile, that temperature spiked to just about 60 degrees Celsius there at week 2. And you can see it stayed above that 54 degrees Celsius temperature that's needed to deactivate pathogens for almost 6 weeks. So this pile worked extremely, extremely well. I had very good breakdown of all of those organic tissues and the bones and so on. Then after, again, about 75 days, 10, 11 weeks, I had that temperature drop down below 45 Celsius. So I turned that pile, and you can see I had another second peak. Again, that was over 60 degrees Celsius again, and it stayed that way for a couple weeks before temperature then dropped. And then at that time, that compost would have been stable, and it would have been maturing, and then it could have been used as fertilizer or used to mix with other material for composting. So here's a picture. This is a rib bone after 10 weeks of composting. You can see the flesh is all gone, and that rib bone is not as strong as it was in the live animal. Rib bones actually will split apart. You'll be able to break those with your hands pretty easily. On that right-hand picture, you can see bones from 2 layers of carcasses. That on the bottom is the skull. You can kind of see the horn there sticking off to the right. And above, that's a leg bone. And the skulls of these goats, after composting, you're able to take your thumb and just push it right through the bone in the head. It's just amazing what those bacteria can do, because they're just going to decalcify those bones, and they'll be very brittle and they break very easily. Composting and diseased animals. You can prevent potential disease spread if you do have animals that die of disease by composting close to that infected site. You can't even compost in the barn, and if you are composting in the barn or wherever you are, you want to compost the bedding, the litter, the animals, everything from that diseased animal. One of the advantages of composting right in the barn where those animals were raised is that then you're not moving that material anywhere else. When you move that material, then you are running the risk of perhaps spreading whatever disease that was to other areas of your farm. But if you compost right in the barn, you build a good compost pile, you make sure you have high pile temperatures that reach all parts of the pile, then you can generally control that disease or prevent disease spread. To get the high pile temperatures throughout the pile, you're generally then going to have to turn that pile so those areas on the outside of the pile get turned into the middle of the pile after turning, so that they then too are exposed to very high heat. If you are composting diseased animals, you do have to take safety precautions. And actually, anytime that you're composting, you should have some type of hand protection, at least rubber gloves, some type of body protection, either washable coveralls or some disposable outer garment, some type of head cover, some type of rubber boots or something that you can disinfect. You want to wear some type of goggles or protective eyewear so you're not getting anything in those mucous membranes along the eye. And depending upon what the animal may have died from, you may want to have some type of respirator. Q fever, for example, problem we have in the States here with goats can be aerosolized, so that if you have animals that die of Q fever, you definitely want to use a respirator, and you actually may want to mist water on things before you even work with it to prevent dust. So these are just some safety precautions that you may want to take when you are composting particularly diseased animals. At some point on your farm, you may have to put animals down, euthanasia, and the most common euthanasia drug here in the States that is used is sodium pentobarbital. There are secondary toxicosis concerns of carcasses, that have been killed using, or animals that have been killed using sodium pentobarbital. You certainly don't want to have birds feeding on those euthanized animals. You don't want to have any scavengers consuming those euthanized animals. Again, because that sodium pentobarbital is in those tissues, you don't want other animals consuming that material. There also is potential for that to leach into the soil. If you are composting animals that have been put down, you want to make sure that you build a good pile. Again, you have high temperatures, you may want to turn that pile, and so on. Some of the research on this is conflicting. Some say that it's not detectable. Some people have found it. In any case, if you are building a pile, you are turning a pile, so you're mixing all those contents, whatever sodium pentobarbital residues may be there would be diluted in a large amount of carbon source material and generally should not be a problem. But you do need proper pile construction and good management. Composting in prions, and prions are those agents that are responsible for that family of disease known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Scrapie in sheep and goats is a TSE. Mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalopathy is another. Here in the United States, we have wasting disease in deer, wild deer, which is another TSE. There's actually even a feline form of TSE. The heat that is generated in a compost pile is nowhere near high enough to kill a prion. The prions require extremely, extremely high heat. So any animal that is suspected to have died from any of these diseases should likely be incinerated. It should not be composted because the composting will not kill that process. So some of the problems that you may encounter in composting are listed here. And I am sorry to say that I have encountered all of these problems. So I speak from experience as I go through each of these things that you may need to troubleshoot. If your pile has low temperature, there's generally too little moisture. Those bacteria are starved for water. They don't have anything to work with. Or there may be too much pile moisture and you're having that anaerobic decomposition. And I've probably had both of those. So there you need to check that pile moisture and adjust. Improper carbon-nitrogen ratio. Perhaps you have too many carcasses and not enough carbon source. You may have carbon material that does not pack tightly enough to insulate the pile. So you may lose heat, particularly at night. If you are keeping a thermometer in your pile and you're checking pile temperature during the day and it's hot, and then in the morning you check right away and it's cool, then you may be losing heat at night because the covering layer is not thick enough. If that's the case, that cover layer may need to be added to, or you may need to mix some manure or finished compost with that cover layer to make sure that you're not losing heat. Pile odor is generally from compost that is too wet. And if it is too wet, then you need to open that pile and either let it dry or add some additional carbon source. If you are using bins that have sides, wooden bins, and they're not covered, they may trap rainwater along the side, and those areas then could be too wet and they're not going to compost properly, and they are then going to generate some odors as well. Too low a carbon-nitrogen ratio, too thin a covering layer, we've talked about that. So here's a wooden bin. As you can see, this area right here, this darker area is much wetter than that area off to the side, and I do believe that was because it was kind of piled up in the center, so rain would wash to the side, and then we had this real wet area. And actually towards the bottom of that area, it was almost kind of soupy. And you can see here the flesh had not decomposed. So this was a problem in that pile. And that pile needed to be aired out and turned and mixed with some additional carbon source material. If your pile just isn't working, your carcasses aren't decomposing, Again, you may have too many carcasses in that pile, they're too close together, or again, your pile is too wet. If you have insects or fly larvae, that generally means that there are some type of odor emanating from your pile. Again, your cover layer may be too thin, and these odors may be something that you or I can't smell, but obviously a fly can. So if you have a lot of flies on your pile, then generally, then there's some type of problem. Also, you may have leachate coming out from the bottom of the pile, and that's going to create odors, and that's going to attract flies. So for leachate, again, you want to make sure that you have a thick enough base layer that has the ability to absorb moisture, and again, have a concrete pad, because that's going to prevent that leachate from running into the soil as well. So here's an example of leachate. You can see that black area right at the base of the boards in front of that bin, and that is from liquid that is leaching from the pile that's inside. And that leachate then not only can attract flies and so on, if it does run off the concrete pad, then it could contaminate the soil, and depending where your bin is, then surface water, groundwater has the potential to be contaminated as well, and that's not something that we want to have happen. So here's just a quick rundown of those troubleshooting problems, and I didn't mention scavengers, but I talked about that before. Some type of fencing around would help prevent that. So compost use, you can use about 1/2 of a new pile can be material that has already been composted. Mix that with the new carbon source material, and then you're ready to compost. You can apply that to pasture land, agricultural land, to horticultural crops, tree crops perhaps. Here we don't recommend using small stock mortality compost on vegetables or areas where food's produced for direct human consumption, just as a safety measure. In 2014, I held a conference here where I invited some very, very good speakers to talk about different aspects of mortality composting. And I would urge you to go to our website, goats.langston.edu, and navigate yourself to the mortality composting area in our library, and then look at those proceedings. And the papers and the presentations were actually quite good. The people that I invited knew a heck of a lot more than me, and they were very willing to share of their knowledge. Another website that has excellent information on composting is the Cornell Waste Management Institute, and that URL is listing there. And you can see here in composting, health, safety, large-scale composting, mortality composting, just a lot of different issues. And if you go there, make sure you read about where they composted a whale. That's kind of an interesting story, along with some pictures there. That's kind of neat. So I have a few slides just about composting poultry mortality. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the same composting principles and rules really apply for any carcass. When you're composting poultry, generally you're going to be using poultry litter as the co-composting ingredient along with the carcass. So again, we want to prevent runoff. We don't want leaching because of poultry litter. We don't want that phosphorus or any other disease agents perhaps getting into groundwater, soil, and so on. And you probably will need straw or rice hulls or something, some other high carbon source material to be layered in the pile. We do not have poultry here, so I don't compost poultry. So I have used this presentation here from the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension on operating a mortality compost bin. So Georgia has a lot of large poultry farms, and we actually do have quite a number of poultry farms here in the state of Oklahoma as well. And our neighboring states such as Arkansas do have a lot of poultry farms. And mortality is an issue. And getting rid of that poultry to create that compost material like you see in that right-hand picture is important. So you'll see the concepts here are basically the same as what we talked about for our goats. So we want an initial layer of fresh litter, 20 to 30 centimeters. It's not quite as thick as that for goats, but again, poultry don't weigh as much as a goat carcass, so it's not compressing that layer. Again, you can kind of preheat that litter wherever you're storing your litter, add some water to that so it can start composting. And then when you build a compost pile, that's already working. It just speeds the process up. So on top of that poultry litter, you can add a thin layer of some carbon material. Here they're using straw. You may want to use rice hulls or something like that. Then you can add your mortality and poultry carcasses, just lay side by side. Don't pile them on top of one another. They will not decompose very well, but lay them side by side and in the center of the bin, and again, away from bin walls, as we mentioned, when we compost all of our livestock. You can add a small amount of water. Generally, if you just wet the carcasses themselves, then that's going to be sufficient. And then you can add a layer of poultry litter about 20 centimeters thick on top of those birds. You can see this young gentleman's doing that, and he's wearing a mask as well. So he's keeping dust and any organisms, out of his respiratory system. So you're going to repeat steps 2 through 6. In other words, you're going to be putting on your litter, some carbon source, your birds, your poultry, a little bit of water, then some more litter, and keep repeating those layers till you get roughly 2 meters in height. And for all of our compost piles, no matter what species you're composting, 2 meters is about as high as you want your compost pile to be. If it's higher than that, then you're going to have a hard time getting air exchange in that pile, and you're going to run out of oxygen, and you're not going to have good decomposition. So about 2 meters is the top. And here again, you want a nice thick cover layer, about 30 centimeters of litter, stop odors, prevent flies and scavengers, and so on. Here, the poultry producers generally are going to use primary bins and secondary bins. So when one primary bin is full, then they can just go and use another one. And again, depending the size of the farm and expected mortality, there are calculations available to help you size the bins that you may need. So after building the pile, we're going to get a high temperature of about 60 degrees Celsius within a few days, and that should stay at that height anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. Then that temperature is going to drop. And when that temperature drops below that target of 54 degrees Celsius, you're going to need to turn that pile, and you're going to get that second heat phase. And generally, poultry producers, they're going to move that material from a primary composting bin to a secondary composting bin when they're mixing that, maybe adding some additional water and getting that ready for the second heat cycle. And then after that second heat cycle, the compost is going to mature or enter that curing phase. Again, adding some water so that you can get that correct moisture content, so you get another spike in temperature to get rid of any undecomposed material that might remain. So in that secondary phase, you're going to get that high temperature of 60 degrees Celsius again, and then that temperature is going to go down, at which time the compost is going to be stable. So just like with our goats, temperature is very critical. We want this decomposition process to be aerobic at those thermophilic temperatures of 40 to 70 degrees Celsius, which is much faster than the mesophilic temperatures of 10 to 40. If temperature gets too high, about 65 degrees Celsius for a period of time, you really should open that pile and let that cool down, because what's going to happen is the pile gets too hot, and then that's going to kill off the beneficial bacteria that you have working. So you don't want too high of compost temperatures. Another issue with too high temperature, if you get above 70 degrees Celsius for a period of time, is that spontaneous combustion can occur. And here you can see a couple pictures of very, very hot poultry compost piles where it actually started the wood on the bins, around the bins on fire. So that's something that that you have to watch for if your compost bins get too hot. The end of that secondary phase then is internal temperature drops down really to ambient temperature. Your bulk density is going to decrease. You're going to get this nice looking product that really does not have any unpleasant odor that you can then use as fertilizer. And you can go to the University of Georgia Extension site to get more information on composting poultry mortality. Here from the Cornell site, this is just an example of a small, more producer-sized wooden bin that's used for poultry. Again, those slats on the front allow for air exchange. It does have a concrete pad to prevent leachate, and it does have a gravel area for working in front of it and a roof to keep off rain. So it's actually a nice looking compost bin. Avian influenza in composting. There are certain diseases of poultry which can be taken care of by composting. Again, you need to check with whatever local authorities are near you on disposal methods for poultry that have died of various diseases. The Cornell Waste Management Institute does have information on emergency composting for diseased poultry and diseased ruminants as well. And they do have a website here on avian influenza and composting poultry. And they do state that it can control at least some forms of avian influenza. It does have to be done correctly, obviously, and you do have to have that high heat in that pile. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation now, and then if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. Are there any questions? I don't see any on the chat, so maybe not. That's my compost pile behind me. There you see it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Merkel, for your very informative presentation. While waiting for my video to be on by our host, we have some few questions here. All right, so first to ask a query from Dr. Baroga. Yeah, so I'm having the video on. Again, thank you very much. The first question is from Dr. Baroga. Do you use a composting additive, and how much does it cost?
No additives at all. There's really no need to use an additive. It'll work.
It will work just with water and some house, right?
That's correct.
Right. And next, from Gary Lasaga, how do you manage odor and the possible public health impact of this?
Most of the mortality that we would have would not be diseased animals. If there are animals that are that would die from reportable diseases or so on, oftentimes they may not be composted, they would be incinerated. But normal mortality, say just due to internal parasites or something like that, you can compost and you really don't have to worry about public health hazard. And keeping the compost piles, again, away from people, away from streams, away from buildings. Generally, it should be, at least 100 meters away from everything, and farther the better.
Yeah, I was going to ask how far should it be placed near the deep well, for example, because we have a lot of deep wells here in the Philippines, so 100 meters away would be.
Yeah, if possible. Sometimes it's not possible, I know, in heavily populated areas, but.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Dr. Merkel. And another question from Cesar Thiongson. Do you need to break the bones? As our experience, if we bury our mortality bones, are still intact even 100 days and above in a composting pit.
Yeah, generally what I would do is take whatever bones remain and just throw them in the next mortality compost pile. And then over time they are going to break down. But particularly very thick, very strong bones, yeah, they may not break down in that first heat cycle. And even after 2 heat cycles, if they remain, just throw them in the next pile.
All right, so that is very clear. Thank you, Dr. Merkel. Still from Mr. Cesar Teongson. This is good in African swine fever cases, where we can convert the barn into the composting pit, but we need 70 degrees Celsius to kill the virus. How can we achieve that high temperature?
70 is pretty high for a mortality compost pile. If it's well managed, you may get there. But again, if your temperature gets above 65 degrees Celsius, you may be killing off some of those bacteria. So 70 degrees Celsius could be difficult to reach and then also to maintain. So I'm not sure what the best way to get there is, other than just to make sure that your pile is very well managed and you have proper moisture content.
All right. Okay. All right. From Theodosia Haraba, why is there a need to preheat during the poultry mortality composting?
Yeah, there really wouldn't be a need to preheat. The only thing that does is it just helps the composting or the decomposition get started faster. If the pile's already hot, when you put the poultry carcasses on, that means that those bacteria are already active, they're living, they're already working, so that they can start working right away.
All right.
So there's really no lag time.
So it will be quicker for them to decompose. All right.
Correct.
And last question from our Q&A, then we will have Miss Elaine for other questions from our participants. From Theodosia Haraba still, you have made mention about curing phase. How long would it take?
The curing phase, I'm not sure that there's just a definite length of time for that. The compost will cure really until it gets to about ambient temperature, and then it would be done. I can't really state how long that would be.
All right.
Because it will still continue to work for a while, even after you put it in a secondary bin or after that second heat cycle.
All right. So from Norberto Labata, thank you for sharing your knowledge to us. But by turning, what do you mean by it? The turning of the carcass.
Yeah, turning is just, say if you had a tractor, you would just scoop up the material and lift it up and mix it. So turning is basically just mixing. So ideally, like in this pile behind me, you would mix it so all this material around the edges would be in the center, so that you get all of that pile heated evenly. So that's really the goal of turning, is to get everything mixed up.
All right. Take by turn. All right. And Miss Elaine, we have questions in Facebook Live.
Yes, good morning, Doc Merkel. These are the questions from our Facebook page from Sir Adonis Cavitin. Can I use carbonized rice hull as source of carbon for composting?
I've never used that. I assume that you could. You may want to mix that with something else, but you probably could. I would probably mix it with something else. You need a carbon source that's able to be broken down, because the bacteria are using the carbon source for carbon skeletons. They're using the nitrogen source for nitrogen, so that they can make bacterial protein so that they can reproduce. So that carbon source has to be able to be broken down by that bacteria fairly readily.
Okay, okay. Another question, Doc, from Adonis Kabiten. How long does it take for a mortality composting ready to use in agricultural land?
I would say well, at least a minimum of 150 days and probably longer. So you're looking at what? How many months is that? Five to 6 months, something like that. So,
So
so
it will
it does take a while.
Okay, last question from our Facebook Live from Ms. Rosel Pacuti Kudal. Is too high ambient temperature a good or bad thing?
In a well-built mortality compost pile, if the ambient temperature is high, it just kind of helps things along. But even if the ambient temperature is, say, 40 degrees, if it's 40 degrees Celsius outside, you still want the inside of your pile to be 55 or 60. Even if the outside temperature is 10 degrees Celsius, you still want the internal pile temperature to be 55 or 60. So it's just that with high ambient temperature, you probably don't need quite as much insulation. I mean, here in the United States, people compost in the winter. I mean, I didn't include the picture in this presentation, but I have a picture of a compost pile with snow on it, and the temperature was probably about -6 or -8 Celsius, but the inside of that pile was still roughly 50 degrees Celsius. So.
Okay, thanks, Doc Merkel. I think there are other questions pa from our Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Ma'am Elaine. By the way, we also have mortality composting here at the ITCPH, and in the Philippines, farmers also do this through the use of this technology. Which do you consider the best? Because in the pictures I've seen, the pile or the compost pit are above the soil. Some are on top of the wood, and some uses cement for the pile. So which do you consider the best for the situation we have in the Philippines, considering that we always experience heavy rainfalls?
Yeah, in any case, you want to make sure that your bottom layer is very thick so that it can absorb whatever liquid comes out of the pile. You don't want to have soil contamination. If you do have a concrete pad, then that just kind of helps prevent water from getting into the soil, and it allows that carbon source to absorb it. In your case, a roof or some type of even plastic tarp covering, I think, would be beneficial to keep rainwater away from the pile. If you are doing that and your pile is well built, it could just be on soil. I mean, we do piles here just on soil as well.
So our roofing is really recommended for the compost pit here in the Philippines, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Merkel. And we have a few questions left. All right. From Cesar Tiongson, can we dig from the soil and put the carbon source instead of a shaded one in those pictures? Is it possible?
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that question, please.
Can we dig from the soil and put the carbon source instead of a shaded one in the picture you showed?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he means, but there's really no need to dig any of the soil out to site your compost pile. You can just site it right on top of the soil if that's what he means. There's really no need to be digging anything out.
Yeah, maybe Mr. Cesar, can you still make clear of these questions so we can make another query for this? And next, all right, regarding to poultry, I know you shared some presentation of another expert in this, but just in case you know the answer, for a poultry shed of 35,000 heads and a mortality of 50 heads per day, how large and deep should be the mortality pit?
50 per day.
Yeah,
I'd
50 per day. In
have to
poultry.
look and send, there are formulas available. I don't know those off the top of my head, but there are formulas available where you can estimate, you know, the average mortality per day, the weight of that mortality, and then it would cite give you recommendations on bin size. 50 per day
Yeah.
for 365 days a year, that's a lot of mortality. So you're going to need a fair number of, you know, fair number of bins for that. I would have to search and get some of those figures.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Merkel. And we have a lot of questions still, and we have time for it. From Rodolfo Medrano, is ammonia buildup a common problem in mortality composting?
No, not really. Those bacteria that are living in the pile are going to be using that ammonia. So they're going to be scavenging that ammonia.
All right. I think we don't have any questions. Some questions are being clarified earlier. Ma'am Elaine, do you have questions still?
None at all.
None at all.
No more questions in our Facebook page.
By the way, our center director is also watching via Facebook Live. Hello, Doc Ruth. All right. Right. We'll just read some of the chat rooms here, just to make sure we don't miss any questions. We make use of the time we have today. All right. Okay. No more questions? How about from our staff? All right. So I think we don't have any questions, but in case some participants are willing to ask more questions, we may have to send our queries to Dr. Merkel. All right. So I think that ends our webinar series this morning. So for our host, Sir Gerald, Ma'am Amy, who is also here in our panel, Ma'am Elaine, who is also our moderator, thank you very much. And in behalf of our management and the ITCPH, we would like to thank you, Dr. Roger Merkel, for sharing your time with us today to share the very important things to be remembered in terms of composting hogs, poultry, and other animals. Ma'am Amy, do you have any last words? Ma'am Amy is muted. Yan.
Well, for giving us time. I know it's already evening there. And thank you so much for always supporting us.
Oh, no problem.
See you later, sometime.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Roger Merkel, and we hope to have you next in our webinar series this year or next year. And this ends our webinar series for our 35th founding anniversary of the ITCPH. And for more discussions, or if you want to visit our discussion earlier, you may visit our Facebook page. You may search International Training Center on Pig Husbandry. All the recorded videos and the webinar series are posted online. So if you want to get back and check all the discussions from our experts, you may come and visit. And of course, do not forget to like our page to be updated with all the projects and activities of our center. Again, happy 35 years ITCPH, and we wish you all the best. And I think this ends our webinar series this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.